I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and tonight we are going to revisit probably my biggest yarn dyeing fail ever and try to do the same technique with the same colors but end up with something that isn't an oops, that isn't a fail. And I'm specifically talking about one of the first times I tried to speckle yarn where I added way too much dye powder onto the yarn, and we ended up with this like beautiful evil fairy colorway, but it bled in a lot, and really speckling with 3 primary colors, this is not where I thought it would go. Now, I reacted to that video last year, but today we're gonna speckle on some yarn with these 3 primary colors, going for a heavy countertop speckled colorway, but hopefully not massively overdoing it. Before we go any further, I would like to give a huge shout out and thank you to today's lab partner, Dee. Dee, thank you so much for being my lab partner for this episode of DyepotWeekly. I really hope you're gonna enjoy the yarn. Since we're gonna be speckling yarn with dry dye powders, I will be wearing a deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves whenever I'm dealing with the dry dye powder. So my voice will be a lot more muffled during that filming process. But I think that the main reason why I messed up the first time is that I was speckling with the colors expecting to see the yellow, red, and blue, but the dyes didn't dissolve on the yarn as fast as maybe I thought, so I didn't know where it was going and what it would look like once the dyes actually sunk in. So I kept adding more dye and more dye and more dye and more dye, and thereby overdoing it. Now, this is a line that is hard to define when you're dyeing yarn, because when you're not measuring out the dyes, when you're dyeing by feel with the straight dye powders, I guess you learn from experience how little or much you want to add onto the yarn to get the effects that you're going for. And some dye colors that are a premixed pastel, you may need more powder. Some colors like these primaries that are more pigmented, you probably need a little bit less. And so again, some of this comes from getting a hand and a feel for it, which is hard for me to say in video and to like give a sense of like the quantities of dye, but yeah, because again, I'm not going to be measuring anything out. But anyway, let's go to the yarn and our setup for today. The 3 dye colors we're using today are the same that I used back in, what was it, 2018? We have Peacock Blue, Brilliant Yellow, and Fire Engine Red. I am going to use my newer batch of Fire Engine Red. I wish that these had like a date on them so I could know when the older one was from, because I intended to do like an old versus new comparison, which I never did. If that's something that I should do. The problem is I don't remember the note that they had about the solubility of this color on the website that long ago, so is what it is. But we're going to use the new one. And the Peacock Blue is probably the same batch that I had in the original video. The Brilliant Yellow is not. I've had to repurchase that a few times. Our yarn today is Knit Picks Stroll Fingering Weight yarn. This yarn is 75% superwash merino wool, 25% nylon, and I've pre-soaked it in plain tap water with no acid. We're gonna add some acid to it now so that way our colors can strike. And I'm also gonna set up a steamer basket off camera because after we add the dye onto the yarn, we're gonna steam set everything. The main reason why I pre-soak yarn with no acid is that it gives me flexibility depending on the project that I want to do if I change my mind and want to do something else. And then I also remember that I added acid and how much acid I added right before I use it. So let's add 2, 3, 4, 5 tablespoons of white vinegar in here. I mean, really, I've got 400 grams of yarn pre-soaked. 1 will be a yarn mop. The other 3 will be for our speckled colorway. Since I didn't measure the amount of water that's in here, the amount of acid that I add to the pre-soak is a little bit arbitrary. Sometimes you can do a nice glug of white vinegar, but we don't need to wait long because the yarn is now ready to go. For all the yarn, including the yarn mop, I want to remove most of the water. But there is still, like, the yarn's at a place where I could squeeze it and more water could come out, but it's not dripping. The amount of water that is in your yarn can probably influence how much or how little the different colors will spread. Which one is trapped? There we go. So if there's a lot of water, then as the dyes dissolve in the yarn, they can sort of wick through a little bit more. And if there's less water in there, the dyes will sort of slowly dissolve and then stay put a little bit more. So it really does depend on what you're going for. And I'll have to look back and see if I've ever done side-by-side speckles on like super wet versus just barely damp yarn. So let me know if that's something you would like to see. But now I'm going to spread out 3 of the skeins on my countertop, exposing as much of the yarn as I can. And one of the skeins will stay in the aluminum pan. That'll be the yarn mop I'll use to wipe dry powder off of my gloved fingertips during this whole process. And now I'm going to go put on that safety equipment that I mentioned earlier. I'm going to go put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves, so that way I am protected while we're dealing with the dry dye powder. Now I am dyeing yarn in my kitchen. My counter is protected with a shower curtain, and everything that is used for the preparation of food is put away. And so I do a big clean before transitioning my kitchen back into like a home kitchen. Let's start with our red. So to do this, I'm going to take a tiny pinch of dye. Like, you can kind of see there's a little bit on the glove. And then keeping my fingers held together and occasionally letting a little bit of a bigger amount fall. But I'm speckling onto the yarn. And in areas where there's a bigger selection of the color, like a bigger chunk, those will be bigger patches. If you want the speckles to be really fine and small, then I recommend mixing your dyes with citric acid powder. But the other thing you can do is try to take an even smaller pinch and really try to let only a tiny bit of dye fall, so that way you can only see like a tiny speck. Tiny speck of color. But you can see, like, I'm still going pretty heavy in some places, but what I'm not doing is dumping it like I might sprinkles on a sugar cookie that you want completely covered. Okay. Now, it's okay if there's going to be stretches without color, because we are adding 2 more colors, but the goal was to create something heavy speckled. I think that since the last time when I was doing this, look at that red. I think that since that was one of the first times probably I had used these dyes, I was also surprised with the color. And this is something important to keep in mind. Now, with red speckles, like with a red dye, we're going to get red speckles. And I want to make sure my hands are dry before we go in to the next color. Let's do the yellow next. But some colors, now brilliant yellow will look mostly yellow with speckles. But a lot of other yellows, like a golden poppy or something, might look more orange with speckles. And honestly, the brilliant yellow could look a little bit more mustard because it's very concentrated in that area. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Now, will we end up with a rainbow on our yarn here today? Maybe. It's possible we'll get some oranges, some greens, and maybe even some purples if the colors blend. However, I have shown in videos that if you want to do color mixing, I prefer to start with like a cyan magenta yellow versus a red, yellow, and blue. All of these colors, I believe, are primaries at Dharma. But to get a nice bright green or bright purple, you really want a cyan in there. And you can mix a red from magenta and yellow, which was a huge surprise for me. Oh man, now I'm beginning to wonder, like, am I adding too much dye? I'm adding a lot of dye. I'm looking at this and I'm like, oh gosh, I really, really hope. Wouldn't that be funny if I accidentally make an oops when I'm trying to not do an oops? Oh man. Now, in terms of yellow speckles, Brilliant Yellow both can, oh no, I don't want the red. I already did the red. In terms of speckles, Brilliant Yellow can stripe to the yarn pretty quickly, but it doesn't really show up very well with speckling just because it's very low contrast between white and pigmented Brilliant Yellow. But I also think it does spread out a little bit. Okay, I went for the red again. Okay, Peacock Blue. I don't use Peacock Blue that often. So it's funny because this is looking so much like the yarn in the video to me, but I think I just know I'm adding on way less dye. At least I hope I am. Because the reason why I know now how much dye I added in that other video is that I partitioned the dye in a cup and used it up and went back for more. Whereas now I'm taking a tiny little pinch of dye, which you can't really tell because I have dye on my fingertips, and then using that one pinch across the yarn before going back and taking another tiny pinch. And so I'm using a lot less. And it's funny because it looks like, with the way that these colors are going, it looks like I'm using way more blue, or way less blue than the other colors. But the other colors have had time to sink in, and the blue hasn't. Whoop. Adding a little bit more. Okay. Now, the other thing that confused me in the original video is that the blue here looks really, really navy. And the red looks pretty burgundy. But the blue, I mean, it's a deep blue. It's not navy. It is more of like a classic Crayola blue marker. So just throwing that out there. But even taking that extra dye on my fingertips, rubbing it on the yarn, this yarn doesn't feel very rainbow right now. It feels very yellow, red, and blue. But what I want to do at this point is let everything sit on my countertop for a little while. I want to do that because I just want to give some time to let these dyes sink in before I flip the yarn over. Yeah, and so we just want to let them dissolve onto the yarn, and avoiding moving it can help avoid smearing the colors a little bit as well. So I'm going to set a timer for 5 minutes, and then we'll come back to flip the yarn. I don't think things look substantially different from the way they did 5 minutes ago, but let's flip the yarn over. And while I'm doing this, I try really, really hard to not rub it on the counter, because that will spread things out. I try to like lift and pick to spread things out. Now the blue does, and sorry about the dog, everyone, the blue does feel like a minor player so far. I wonder if I need to use more of it, or if it's gonna bloom more once we go and heat set things. Because there are also some colors and some pigments that almost disappear when dissolved and then show back up later. Now, I don't think Peacock Blue is one of those. I'm looking more at you, Hyacinth. So, all right, we've done that. And now, let's speed things up as I add dye onto the side. This time I started with the blue because I felt like it had less impact on the other side. And then when I went into the yellow, I used a little bit less than I had on the other side, just to try to keep things balanced. Now, I think the big thing that's working in my favor today is that the yarn is a little bit more wet than what I might sometimes do if I don't want the speckles to spread too much. If I want those speckles sharper, I would squeeze out more water so it was just damp. But then it takes longer for the colors to sink in, and it's harder to feel what the yarn might look like in the end. And so when I show you the yarn mop that I've been wiping my fingers on in a moment, you can get that feeling as well because the colors are sort of blended throughout the skein already because there's more water in there. But anyway, once I was done adding color, I let everything sit for about 5 minutes before we come back and take a look at everything. Now, if
I didn't have as much liquid in our skeins. I might move the yarn around and open it up inside to add more dye onto it. I'm not going to do that today. What I'm going to do is pick up the yarn, and as I pick it up, I'm looking for big white patches, but the yarn's going to be touching itself as we go into my steamer basket to steam set for 30 minutes. And now, as for all this dye that's left, we have our glorious yarn mop here, and I debated if we should go for a second skein to pick up all this color or what. And so since this is the only round I'm doing, I'm going slow, putting the yarn on and moving it around. And the reason why I'm going slow is because I'm trying to give different parts of the yarn access to colors. And now that I'm blending it and mixing it here, we're finally starting to see sort of a muted rainbow come out. Now also as we go, you can see some dye is smearing on the counter. So I will still need to clean this work surface, but we have this really, really pretty, very muted rainbow we'll show at the end. Like the colors are muddier than they were before, but still quite beautiful. So she's gonna sit aside and wait for a steamer basket to free up, and then after the other timer's done, then I can steam set this mop.
Now in my oops video, I partitioned dye out before speckling onto the yarn. And this is something that you can do if you want to make sure you cap the amount of dye that you've partitioned. If you want to say, gosh, okay, I want to measure out 1/2 gram of each of the 3 colors to dye 300 grams of yarn. I know that this shouldn't be too much dye, and if I use all of it, I could still be within a realm that maybe is okay. Honestly, I don't know if that's a quantity that would work with speckling. I know that for kettle dyeing, 1.5 grams of dye for 300 grams of yarn is a reasonable amount, but with speckling, given that the dyes are very concentrated on small areas of yarn, I imagine you would need a lot less than that. But this is something that you could do to make sure you don't overdo things. But I guess I have the experience now where I don't need to do that. Now, another thing that you can do if you want to avoid adding too much dye onto your yarn is to dilute your dyes with something like citric acid if you want sharper speckles, or you could even use salt if you want the colors to be a little bit more blown out, but to add less pigment in each individual spot. And in the 2024 Hanukkah, that's exactly what I did, because one of the colors was a little too concentrated in places and the dyes were bleeding when I went to wash it. And so I reformulated the colorway by diluting one of the colors with, I think, salt. So that way I could still get a similar effect, but that way it would help me use less of the most intense pigment. So that way I could get, I guess, the colorway that I was going for. Anyway, I hope these tips help, but let's go to our steamer basket. It has been over 30 minutes because technically I forgot. I forgot to set the timer initially, but oh, this is pretty. I would say, yep, just as my impressions were, the blue really did speckle well, and the red and the yellow spread out a little bit more. And that runoff is looking really clear, and you know what? I feel like this is what I was going for with that original colorway. Even though I think originally, back when I dyed this, I was really hoping for a lot of greens and purples in here as well to match the Hanukkah candles that I had, but this is so pretty, and so I'm happy. Now, I'm gonna set the yarn aside to cool completely so we can wash it. And in the meantime, bring over the yarn mop. And this time, I'm gonna remember to set the timer. So after 30 minutes, I'm gonna remove this, set it aside off camera. I'll wash this one off camera, but next, I'll show you the washing of this pretty yarn. We're gonna wash the speckled yarn, but before we do, I'm gonna add a little bit of some dish soap into the water. I need more clear dish soap. I feel like the Blue Dawn sometimes I didn't use very much, but sometimes it uses a little bit of a hint. But the reason for putting the soap in is to prevent backstaining in case we have color bleeding. Now, I'm not anticipating color bleeding, but sometimes, especially with like speckling yarn on the countertop, you could have dye powder that's on the surface of the yarn that never dissolved until now we're submerging it. So there's always a chance that you could see some color come off right at the beginning. And that isn't something I want you to worry about. But oh my gosh, look at it. We're not in focus, but the blue speckled so well. It's such a finer powder than the yellow or the red. And so it allowed me to spread it out and really get sharp speckles with the straight powder, even with applying it heavy. And the red has some glorious speckles too. The yellow definitely spread more, but I think I was a little bit heavier there. I'm gonna add some more soap this time. We didn't see any color bleeding, which is fantastic. Now the other thing, and we're washing with cold water, the other thing I wanna do is really submerge the zip ties and just let them soak for a while. Because powder can also get on those zip ties, and we want it to dissolve and not stay on the ties where it might stain other projects. So I'm just gonna let things sit in here for a minute or two, not because it needs a soak, but again, with countertop speckles, it's nice to have things submerged for a period of time. The other nice thing with doing a little bit of a soak is just to show that you don't have to be fast when you're wetting the yarn. Now, if you had not heat set the yarn first and went and immersed it in water directly, you could get some speckles still, but you'll also get a lot of color bleed because the colors didn't have time to set. And I do have videos where I've done that, but this is so fun. And even though I was really heavy and a little concerned that maybe I had too much dye on there, we did it. And I successfully created the colorway I had originally aimed for. Even though I don't think that this is what I had in my head, but the speckles do look like drips of wax, and so that's really fun. But anyway, I'm gonna finish rinsing out the soap, and then I'm gonna put the yarn through my spin dryer just to remove a lot of liquid. The spin dryer is nice because you aren't like squeezing or wringing out the yarn, it's just spinning the water out, and then the yarn dries nice and fluffy. So yeah, but let's look at the finished dry yarn. Well, how is that for some heavy speckled yarn? You know, standing far back, I pick up on the blue, red, and yellow, but not on a ton of blending. I mean, unquestionably, there are notes that feel orange, some notes that feel more green, and you can find those throughout the yarn when you zoom in. The one blended color we don't really have a lot of is purple, and maybe we have a little bit there. Now, of our three colors, our blue has given us the sharpest speckles. You can see the tiniest little pricks of that color. Whereas the red is a little bit bigger, a little bit more blown out. We do have some teeny tiny red speckles, just like we have some blue that are more blown out. But overall, the blues give us the most fine speckles. The reds give us something a little bigger and in between, and the yellows give us very big, much more splotched speckles. There may be some tiny points of yellow. I think I see a handful, but mostly the yellow sections are larger, a bit like that. No matter what, this colorway is beautiful, and I definitely did not use way too much dye, and for that I am thrilled. Now, the yarn mop for today gives off a lot more watercolor vibes. The colors are more spread out from me wiping my hands on it, and from running the counter, things are very blended and a little bit more muted. You could call it muddy, but even though like the colors are quote muddied, that makes it sound bad. It's got a beautiful, less bright, earthy quality to it that I really do like. Now the yarn mop is related to the main colorway, but the main colorway is a lot more bright and doesn't have as much muting of the colors. Even though we layered 3 primary colors on top of each other, in the speckled colorway, we didn't end up with brown. Maybe we have a few brownish notes here, but not very many. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I love to dye yarn, sharing all my successes and failures along the way. And the best way to learn how not to use too much dye on a project is, unfortunately, to try it out and do trial and error. Now, if you're nervous, you can weigh out your dye powders ahead of time, and you can dilute them with citric acid, salt, or even sugar crystals to help you spread the dyes out further and take a smaller pinch of actual pigment each time you reach into those powders. But mainly when you're doing countertop speckles, the colors are going to spread a lot more from how you first place them. And so if you give it a little bit of time before you add more dye, then you can get a feel of what's going to happen. You also could speckle on one side of the yarn, steam set it for a little bit, remove it, let it cool, then speckle more. And you can do that in stages if that makes you more comfortable, slowly building up the color until you have what you want. There are a lot of different choices, and as the dyer, you can make them as you see fit. Now, one thing I would love to do someday is to get a steamer insert for one of my large catering steam pans, so then I can have the yarn pretty spread out and exposed to steam, but not immersed in water when I try speckling on it. I think that that could be pretty fun. I did buy a handheld steamer thinking I could try adding steam to the yarn on the countertop, but there's no way to direct the steam downwards safely without spilling hot water or something onto the yarn, which again would defeat the purpose. So anyway, I'm always brainstorming different setups and ideas for doing things like this. Dee, thank you so much for being my lab partner for today's episode of Dyepot Weekly. I really hope that you're gonna love your yarn and that you've enjoyed this video. And if you at home want to learn how you can become a lab partner like Dee, go and check out the listings in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. There are 2 different types of lab partner listings. One that's just called Lab Partner, where you can pick the yarn base, tell me some colors to avoid, and I'll start filming a video with you in mind. And the other is the Last Minute Lab Partner listing, where you can take a look at some of the videos I've filmed but haven't started editing yet for one reason or another, and those define a yarn base and even give you some hints about the colors. And I will film some last minute shout outs to include in the video to thank you for being my lab partner. If you have questions about the difference, please let me know either down in the comments or reach out to me on Etsy. Dee, thank you again for being my lab partner. Now, there's some projects that I've done over the years that I don't want to revisit. I'm looking at you, jelly beans. Never gonna do that one again. But there are other things that I would be happy to try again, or if it was something that ended up in an oops, maybe I would try again in a way that I think would end up with something more successful. So if there's a video of mine that you love, let me know down in the comments. Give me the episode number of Dyepot Weekly, or YouTube doesn't let people link, but if you give just the title of a video and maybe around when it came out, then I should be able to find it pretty easily. I have too many ideas of different ways to play around with yarn, dyes, and color. And I feel like every year that I do this, every month I do this, I learn more and more and am getting better at creating what I want with intention. But as I say that, the most happy I ever am with a project is when I go into a project being like, I want to combine these colors with this technique. I wonder how it'll turn out. Versus when I have something super specific in my brain, then I can be a lot more critical of myself in the end, versus the more free-flowing approach. So that's something to just keep in mind. But anyway, thank you so much for watching.